450 feet long, 75 feet wide, 45 feet high. 3 massive, sprawling decks. These were not the dimensions of a simple boat. They were the architectural blueprints for the salvation of the world, delivered not to an army of engineers, but to a single man. The instructions from God to Noah were direct, clear, and supernaturally specific. The divine command left no room for interpretation, no margin for human error, and no space for doubt. Make yourself an ark. And with that singular, earth-shattering voice echoing in his spirit, Noah initiated what would become one of the most colossal and impossible feats of engineering ever undertaken by human hands. We know the famous summary: the animals, the rain, the rainbow. But to transform a divine word into a physical fortress of timber, massive beams, and unyielding structure, Noah had to confront titanic physical challenges. Challenges that the ancient text does not explicitly detail in its brief verses, but that any ancient master builder would understand with terrifying clarity. If you have never heard the full, grinding, sweat-soaked story of what it actually took to build this vessel, and the harrowing 370 days spent locked inside its belly, stay with us. Like this video so more people can discover the staggering truths hidden in these ancient stories. Subscribe so you never miss a chapter of history. And now, let the story begin. The world before the flood was a realm we can scarcely comprehend today. It was an age of corrupted greatness, of violence that saturated the very soil, and of a humanity that had turned its collective back on its creator. But beneath the spiritual darkness, there was also a unique physical environment. Genesis tells us that the Lord God had not yet sent rain upon the earth, but a mist went up from the land and watered the whole face of the ground. This means the soil of the ancient world was perpetually damp, rich, and heavily saturated. This was the environment in which Noah was commanded to build a structure the size of a modern ocean liner. A vessel of this impossible magnitude could not simply be erected in any random clearing. It demanded a vast, flat, and remarkably stable expanse of land, safe from dangerous slopes or shifting mud, yet close enough to the ancient forests of cypress or gopher wood that would serve as the raw material for salvation. Imagine Noah, a man 6 centuries old, but possessing the strength and vigor of the ancients, walking the land. He is analyzing the earth beneath his sandals, testing the firmness of the soil, calculating the proximity to the towering timber. He has no heavy machinery, no surveyors, no topographic maps. He has only his hands, his practical wisdom, and his unshakable faith. When Noah finally selected the perfect ground, the first phase of this holy mandate began, and it was entirely stripped of any spiritual glamour. It was the brutal, back-breaking labor of clearing the earth. They had to excavate massive boulders, tear out deep-rooted stumps, level hundreds of feet of ground, and aggressively compact the earth so it could eventually support thousands of tons of timber and living cargo. They worked with simple, heavy tools of bronze and stone. But there was a relentless adversary in this pre-flood world: the constant, rising humidity. Saturated soil quickly turns to slick, unyielding mud. Heavy tools sink. Hewn wood absorbs the moisture and rots before it is even laid. The building site was incredibly vulnerable. To combat this, Noah and his sons would have needed to dig extensive networks of drainage trenches around the perimeter of the shipyard, creating simple but effective diversions so the Earth's natural rising waters would not turn their sacred project into a quagmire. And as they dug these ditches and leveled this massive plain in the middle of dry land, the people of the ancient world passed by. They watched. Some laughed openly, others whispered insults. What possible sense did it make to prepare a monumental shipyard miles away from any sea? But Noah did not answer their mockery. He did not build according to the logic of his generation. he built according to the blueprint of eternity. Once the massive foundation of Earth was stabilized, flat, and sufficiently drained, a new and terrifying challenge loomed on the horizon: the harvesting of the timber. The divine instruction was explicitly clear. Make thee an ark of gopher wood. These were not fragile saplings. The ancient cypress trees were towering, monolithic giants of the forest, dense, heavy, incredibly rich in natural resins, and perfectly suited for a structure meant to survive the end of the world. Felling just one of these colossal trees with rudimentary axes and sheer physical force was a monumental task. To fell hundreds, perhaps thousands of them, required a daily, bone-crushing discipline that spanned decades. Imagine the rhythm of the ancient forest, strike after strike, hour after hour, until the deafening, earth-shaking crack of the timber echoed through the valleys. But bringing the tree down was only the beginning of the agony. Moving a mammoth trunk from the deep forest to the clearing required genius and grit. Without massive wheeled carts, without legions of draft animals, and without modern cranes, they had to rely on the ancient, grueling method of wooden rollers. Smaller, stripped logs were laid in a path beneath the massive trunk. Using thick, woven ropes and heavy wooden levers, Noah, his 3 sons, and perhaps hired laborers, pulled inch by agonizing inch. When the great log rolled forward, the logs left behind were hurriedly picked up and moved to the front of the line. It was a slow, exhausting, and highly dangerous dance of physics and muscle. Yet, with every single log dragged into the clearing, Noah was laying another stone in the altar of his obedience. Because a man who has heard the voice of the Almighty does not labor for what his eyes can see. He labors for the promise his spirit has grasped. As the mountains of raw timber accumulated in the sprawling clearing, the time arrived for the most complex engineering feat of the entire endeavor. It was not enough to merely cut and move wood. They had to raise a colossal, integrated structure that would not shatter under the unimaginable force of the greatest cataclysm in the history of the earth. For the ark to remain stable, rigid, and unbreakable, Noah had to begin with its spine, the massive central keel that would run the entire length of the vessel. No single tree on earth could provide a beam 450 feet long. Therefore, Noah had to splice together several giant timbers, joining them end to create a perfectly straight, unbroken, and rock-solid foundation. This demanded the precision of a master shipwright. These massive beams were likely joined using ancient but incredibly strong mortise and tenon joints, interlocking shapes carved deeply into the wood. Once fitted together, thick wooden pegs, or trummels, were driven into the joints to lock them permanently. When exposed to moisture later, these wooden pegs would swell, locking the massive beams together with a grip stronger than iron. With the great spine of the ark finally laid upon the earth, a breathtaking moment arrived: the raising of the ribs. These were the heavy, curved timbers that would rise from the keel to form the immense hull of the ark. To ensure the vessel's integrity, each rib had to be carved with absolute precision, fitted into deep sockets along the keel. Now visualize the sheer kinetic energy of this moment. Enormous, arcing beams of solid cypress being hauled upward by heavy ropes thrown over rudimentary wooden shear legs. Noah and his sons straining against the immense weight, their muscles burning, shouting commands to coordinate the lift. They had to constantly adjust angles, checking plumb lines made of heavy stones tied to hemp, ensuring perfect verticality. If even one foundational rib was skewed, the structural integrity of the entire 450-foot vessel would be critically compromised. Slowly, month by month, year by year, the skeletal ribcage of the ark rose against the ancient sky. It must have been a haunting, staggering sight, a wooden leviathan growing in the middle of a dry plain, the size of a modern high-rise building, erected solely through the power of human hands and relentless divine purpose. Yet a beautifully framed structure was entirely useless if it could not keep the oceans out. The ark had to be perfectly, absolutely watertight. God's instruction on this matter was brief, but functionally profound. Pitch it within and without with pitch. This was the grueling process of waterproofing. Ancient pitch, a thick, dark, resinous bitumen drawn from the earth, had to be boiled in massive iron or clay cauldrons until it was a blistering, viscous liquid. It had to be applied while still scalding hot to penetrate the grain of the wood before it hardened into an armor-like shell. But covering just the outside was not enough. Over time, in the dampness of the flood, untreated internal wood would absorb the moisture from the air, warp, and ultimately destroy the ark from the inside out. So, for endless, dark, suffocating weeks, Noah and his sons worked with torches and heavy brushes, smearing the boiling black pitch over every single seam, every joint, every microscopic crack, both inside and outside the massive hull. The stench of the boiling resin must have filled the region. Every layer had to cool and cure before the next was applied. A single overlooked fissure could mean the drowning of humanity. When the final coat of black pitch cooled and hardened into a protective seal, the structure standing in the clearing was no longer just a massive wooden building. It was a hermetically sealed fortress, an impregnable sanctuary engineered to ride out the wrath of God. With the impenetrable exterior shell completed, the focus shifted to the vast, cavernous interior. The ark was about to become the holding vessel for the survival of Earth's biology, and organizing this interior was a logistical nightmare. The biblical text provides a crucial blueprint. Make rooms in the ark. The ancient Hebrew word used here is kinim, which literally translates to nests, cells, or small compartments. The ark was not a massive open warehouse where animals roamed freely. It was a highly structured, meticulously divided labyrinth designed to maintain order, safety, and weight distribution during the chaotic churning of the global flood. While the scriptures do not hand us the exact floor plan, practical logic and ancient shipbuilding principles illuminate what Noah must have done across the 3 towering decks. To maintain the crucial center of gravity and keep the massive vessel from capsizing in the violent waves, the heaviest creatures had to be housed on the bottom. The lowest deck would have been a fortress of heavy timber, holding the massive weight of elephants, rhinoceroses, and large bovines. The middle deck would house the medium-sized beasts, the predators, the great cats, the bears, and the larger domesticated animals. The uppermost deck, closest to the ventilation, would be reserved for the birds, the smaller mammals, and the creeping things, placing the lightest weight at the highest point. The construction of these thousands of individual quinim, these holding cells, was essential for survival. Without strong, secure partitions, predators would inevitably breach their boundaries, animals would be crushed in the rolling waves, and the interior would descend into a slaughterhouse of panic. So Noah built hundreds of internal walls, interlocking them tightly so they would not collapse, yet being careful not to add unnecessary weight to the ship's overall mass. But confining thousands of animals in an enclosed space creates a silent, deadly enemy: toxic gases. Without proper airflow, the buildup of methane and carbon dioxide from animal waste would have suffocated every living thing on board within days. God commanded Noah, "Make a window for the ark and finish it to a cubit from the top." This implies a continuous protected ventilation gap running along the very top edge of the vessel, safely under the overhang of the roof to prevent the torrential rain from pouring in. But to draw that fresh air all the way down into the suffocating depths of the bottom deck, Noah likely had to construct internal slatted corridors and vertical shafts, utilizing the natural convection of rising body heat to pull the heavy, toxic air up and out, while drawing fresh oxygen down. Furthermore, the ark was a floating city that had to sustain its population for over a year. The logistics of food and waste were staggering. God told Noah, "Take with you every sort of food that is eaten and store it up." This meant hauling tons of dried hay, massive bundles of grain, dried fruits, roots, and thousands of clay jars filled with fresh water. Entire sections of the ark's massive decks had to be dedicated strictly to heavily fortified, moisture-proof storage. As for the daily waste produced by thousands of animals, Noah could not afford to manually carry it all up 3 flights of stairs. It is highly plausible that the animal enclosures were built with slightly sloped floors, leading into centralized wooden drainage gutters that channeled the waste towards securely sealed, small scupper flaps near the waterline, allowing gravity to flush the refuse out into the raging sea. When every internal corridor was built, every cell secured, and every jar of water lashed to the walls, Noah faced the single most vulnerable and symbolically profound element of the entire ark: the Great Door. Set into the side of the massive hull, this opening had to be large enough to allow the largest beasts to pass through, yet strong enough to withstand the devastating, crushing impact of towering ocean waves. A weak door would be the death of them all. Noah would have reinforced the massive frame with the thickest, most unyielding timber he had, bracing it with deep diagonal crossbeams. Lacking modern steel hinges capable of bearing tons of weight, the massive door likely pivoted on a gigantic vertical wooden axis, a sheer trunk of hardwood turning deep within stone or heavily pitched wooden sockets. It was a masterpiece of survival engineering. But there is a detail in the ancient text that shifts this story from human engineering to divine intervention. The Bible says, "And the Lord shut him in." Noah labored for decades to cut the timber. Noah spent his blood and sweat carving the joints. Noah hauled the door into its massive frame. But when the time came to secure that threshold against the apocalypse, it was the hand of God that sealed the final crack, locking salvation inside and judgment outside. Before that great door was sealed, the most haunting and majestic event of the pre-flood world occurred. Noah did not have to become a global hunter. He did not have to set traps or track beasts across continents. The text is chillingly clear. They came to Noah to enter the ark. Imagine the surreal, terrifyingly beautiful scene unfolding in the shadow of the great wooden ship. Out of the dense tree lines, emerging from the tall grass, descending from the skies, they came. Pairs of heavy beasts walking with unnatural calm, predators stepping softly beside their natural prey, thousands of birds darkening the sky before coming to rest on the pitched roof, reptiles slithering in perfect, guided unison. It was as if an invisible frequency, an undeniable divine summons, had been broadcast into the very DNA of the animal kingdom. They moved without panic, without aggression, stepping into their designated levels and compartments, as if following a script written before the foundation of the world. It was the ultimate, undeniable validation for Noah's family. The decades of mockery from the surrounding towns were silenced by the rhythmic, thundering footsteps of the animal kingdom submitting to the voice of God. And when the final creature crossed the threshold, Noah, his wife, his 3 sons and their wives, stepped out of the fading light of the old world and into the lantern-lit shadows of the ark. 8 human souls. The Lord shut the door. The sound of that massive timber locking into place must have sounded like the closing of a tomb or the sealing of a vault. Inside, a strange, expectant silence fell over the wooden corridors. Outside, for 7 days, the world continued exactly as it always had. Men ate, drank, and married, completely oblivious to the fact that the door of grace had been permanently shut. And then, in the 600th year of Noah's life, on the 17th day of the 2nd month, the ancient world ended. The catastrophe did not begin with a gentle shower. The scriptures state, "On that day all the fountains of the great deep were broken up. Before the sky fell, the earth shattered." Massive subterranean reservoirs of water, held under unimaginable pressure since creation, violently ruptured the earth's crust. Gigantic fissures tore across the plains, blasting geysers of boiling water and rock miles into the sky. The sheer seismic violence would have thrown Noah and his family to the wooden decks as the ark violently vibrated against the fracturing earth. And then the windows of heaven were opened. It was the first rain humanity had ever seen, and it was a weapon of mass destruction. It was a torrential, blinding, deafening sheet of water that did not cease for 40 days and 40 nights. To the people outside who had laughed at Noah's dry land shipyard, the realization of their doom must have been absolute and horrific. They would have rushed the massive hull of the ark, beating their fists against the pitch-blackened gopher wood, screaming into the roaring tempest as the waters rapidly swallowed their homes, their cities, and the mountains themselves. Inside, the noise of the rain battering the wooden roof must have been a deafening roar that made conversation impossible. The ark, heavy with thousands of tons of life and supplies, shuddered and groaned under the rising tide, until finally, with a massive, creaking lurch that defied gravity, the ark lifted. The great ship tore free from the mud of the earth and began to float. For the next 5 months, 150 days, the waters prevailed. The ark became a solitary, bobbing speck of wood on a violent, shoreless global ocean. There were no sails to catch the wind, no rudder to steer a course, no oars to fight the current. Noah was entirely out of control. The ark was navigated solely by the providence of the Almighty. Inside the dark, swaying hull, lit only by flickering oil lamps, the daily routine of survival was exhausting. The 8 humans worked tirelessly to feed thousands of mouths, clear the waste, calm the distressed beasts during heavy storms, and pray. The smell of the pitch, the heat of the animal bodies, the constant unsettling rocking of the deep. It was a floating crucible of faith. And then, the turning point of the narrative arrives with one of the most beautiful phrases in ancient literature. But God remembered Noah. God sent a fierce, driving wind over the face of the endless ocean, and the waters began to recede. The massive subterranean chasms were closed, the skies were locked, and the long, agonizing wait for the earth to heal began. Slowly, invisibly beneath the waves, the drowned peaks of the mountains began to reach upward. In the 7th month, the grinding, massive hull of the ark suddenly struck solid ground and shuddered to a halt. It came to rest on the jagged, submerged mountains of Ararat. For months, Noah waited as the waters continued to drain away. Finally, he unlatched the heavy wooden window at the top of the ark. The blinding light of a washed world poured into the dark, musky interior. He sent out a raven, a scavenger that flew back and forth across the wreckage of the world. Then, he sent a dove. The first time it returned, finding no clean place to rest its feet. 7 days later, he sent the dove again. This time, as the evening sun began to set, the flutter of wings returned to the window. In its beak was a freshly plucked olive leaf. It was not just a piece of vegetation, it was the ultimate proof of resurrection. The earth was breathing again. Life was pushing through the mud of judgment. After 370 grueling days locked inside the belly of the wooden beast, the final command came. Go out of the ark. The massive door, sealed by God over a year prior, was finally forced open. The blinding sunlight and the sharp, piercing smell of fresh, clean air flooded the decks. The animals poured out, not in the orderly, supernatural procession in which they entered, but rushing, flying, and galloping out into the vast, empty expanse of a brand new world, driven by the instinct to scatter and multiply. When Noah's boots finally struck the soft, damp earth, he did not immediately begin to build a house for himself. He did not run to claim territory. The first act of humanity in the new world was an act of profound worship. Noah gathered stones from the washed earth and built an altar. He offered sacrifices of thanksgiving to the God who had navigated them through the apocalypse. And as the smoke of that offering rose into the clear sky, God made an eternal covenant. He painted his bow in the clouds, taking the weapon of the storm and hanging it in the sky as a promise of peace. The Ark, now empty and silent on the rugged peaks of Ararat, had finished its monumental work. If this story has opened something deep within you, if you now see the splintered wood, the boiling pitch, and the staggering faith behind this ancient event in a new light, share this with someone who needs to encounter these timeless truths today. Every like, every comment, and every share carries this history further into a world that still desperately needs the sanctuary of God's grace. Subscribe to the channel so you are here when we turn the page and uncover the next hidden chapter of history. The stories of old are far from over, and neither is God's work in them. Until next time.